Hey, welcome to the Fuel the Fight podcast. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nick Behringer. We have another great episode. It's just great episode after great episode. And why do we have great episodes? Because we have awesome guests. And today we have yet another awesome guest, a fellow dietitian, Susan Lopez, also known as the Tactical Dietitian, if you follow her on Instagram. But Susan is a great dietitian working out in holistic health and fitness, and also shares her knowledge on Instagram. Is a great communicator, so I wanted to have her on the show to share her knowledge, and she generously agreed to come on the show. So Susan, thanks so much for joining us today.
No, I appreciate it. I've always been a big fan of yours, Nick. So anytime you want to have a conversation, I'm all ready for it.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And, I love talking nutrition. But where I want to start off is because, you wore this, maybe a different camouflage pattern uniform, but you wore this same uniform we've talked about in the past. But for folks who might not be familiar with your background, would you be willing to tell your Army story?
Yeah, absolutely. So probably age myself a little bit here, but yes, at one time I did wear the BDU uniform as a service member. So I actually served as a 68 mic, which is a nutrition care specialist. Back then they were 91 mics, but they're 68 mics now. And I actually joined the military pretty young. I was 17 actually. Graduated high school from a small town in North Dakota. A week later, I found myself in boot camp, well, really at reception, but getting ready for boot camp. And I joined the military as a way to really do something different than kind of the traditional high school, college, job route. I knew that I wasn't ready for college, and I didn't want to stay in the small town that I was in. And lo and behold, the recruiter walks into one of my senior classes one day and offers to show me the world. So joined the military. I did initially join as an Army reservist, and the unit where I lived was a medical unit, and one of the options that they had available was the 91 mic position. I honestly really didn't know what it was. It sounded great. It sounded very medical when they explained it to me, which was something that was appealing to me because I wanted to be able to use that to maybe catapult myself into an occupation later, right? So go to boot camp. I loved boot camp. It was at that point in my life, all of my 17 years of my life, it was probably one of the most challenging things that I had done, but also one of the most rewarding things for me. I had always been kind of a small person, so to be able to do physical feats like that when I hadn't really been very athletic growing up, I fell in love with it. So I'd already made up my mind before I even left boot camp that I was eventually going to go active duty. And this was in 2000. So go through boot camp, go through EIT, get back to my reserve units. Immediately, as soon as I got there, I had the conversation with my command team there. I was like, hey, I really want to do this full time. So I did have to stay with that unit for at least 12 months before I could get released and then go active duty. And it just so happened around that time that 9/11 happened. So this was in late 2001. So I was eventually released from my unit, and then went ahead and enlisted active duty after about a year of being there. As soon as I got to my first unit, they said, don't unpack your bags. First wave is already gone. You're going to be on the second wave. So, just be prepared. So I literally had been at my new unit, and I was with the 86th Combat Support Hospital, is what it was called at that time, at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. 3 months after getting there, I found myself in Kuwait, and then eventually I was there during the surge into Iraq. Still really just a kid, honestly. Didn't really know what I was getting into, didn't really understand the gravity of what was happening around me at that time. But that deployment and the deployment after that, and the time that I spent even in garrison in the military, mostly at Fort Campbell, really kind of shaped what I'm doing now. And had I not had those experiences, tactical dietitian definitely would not exist. During that time, I got to work with some really great dietitians who allowed me to expand myself into the realm of patient care, into the realm of sports nutrition, and really grow outside of just being sort of that nutrition care support person. And that's really what motivated me when I left military service to become a dietitian. So left the military service sometime around 2007, went back to school, got my undergrad, did my internship, became a dietitian with the sole purpose of coming back into a military setting as a civilian. Now, mind you, this is like around 2009. I'm like, you know what, there's not this position yet, but I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to come back. I'm going to serve as a civilian. I'm going to work predominantly with the military. It's going to happen. So worked as a dietitian for 10 years almost. And then lo and behold, H2F pops up. And that's sort of how I ended up here where I am now. I had a lot of experience in between there, of course, as a dietitian working with different tactical athletes, but that is my Army backstory.
No, that's awesome. And I mean, to be, part, like you said, you maybe not appreciated it at 17 to be so young, but, to be in the early stages of the Iraq War, kind of part of that history is so very special. And then I loved your story about becoming a dietitian because you were inspired by other dietitians. So this is something to the young dietitians listening to this, or I definitely remind my students of this when you're working with those 68 mics, invest in them because you never know. That next 68 might be the next dietitian taking care of soldiers going out there. So that's really awesome that through your work with dietitians, that kind of inspired you to go this route. One of the things I kind of wanted to, talk about, you alluded to it a little bit, but, the inspiration behind the tactical dietitian, because you have this cool logo and everything that goes along with it, and this significant following of people that kind of look to you for tactical nutrition information. How did that kind of side of it come about?
So kind of going back to my story, knowing that I wanted to, work as a dietitian in tactical setting, having made that decision early in my college career, I also had always had the dream of having my own private practice or having my own thing. So I had been attempting to build a virtual practice for probably close to 8 years at this point now, where I'm at now. And I struggled with that a little bit. And one of the reasons that I wanted to build that private practice was because I did the military first, and because I had gone to college a little bit later, I already had a family. So I was already married, I already had kids, but I always wanted to work within the realm of sports nutrition or tactical nutrition. And I just couldn't take advantage of a lot of the opportunities to work in collegiate nutrition because I had a family that I had to take care of. So I couldn't do the hours, unfortunately. I couldn't commit that kind of time to it. And for a long time, I felt like that was kind of a disadvantage. But I've never been the type of person to not create an opportunity for me to do the things that I want to do. I actually had a conversation with a friend the other day about this, who I served with in the military. And I said to him, I was like, do you remember like 15 years ago when we talked about what I was going to do with my career? And I was like, I'm doing it. So even though I felt like I was at a disadvantage because I didn't take advantage of some of those opportunities in that realm, I wanted to be able to create something essentially out of what I could do. So that was my goal with creating private practice, but I really didn't know what I was doing at that time, right? virtual online dietitian practices weren't really a huge thing until a few years ago. So I was kind of just pulling things together piece by piece, and I struggled with that a lot. And part of that also was because I didn't really have a voice online. I really didn't know what my voice needed to sound like online. I really didn't have, I hate to say a brand, but I just wasn't really sure how to take a brick and mortar private practice and turn it into something virtual. So I actually invested in some business coaching during that time as well, which helped me. But I think the thing that helped me the most kind of building out that virtual practice was getting really well at being a student of leadership and communication, right? That was a big deal for me, because once I started to get into that sort of study, it helped me really hone my message and find my audience. So for the first few years of my private practice, I was just online as Susan Lopez. I think my handle was Susan CSSD. Very general nutrition information, kind of talking to the masses. And about 3 years ago, I had a very well-known strength and conditioning coach who was on the teams at one point kind of come to me and be like, hey, I'm wanting to do some nutrition for my athletes. I'd really like to work with you and would like for you to develop some programming for me. So I was able to do that, and it performed really well, had lots of great feedback from it. And around that same time, my husband was preparing to enter Ranger Assessment and Selection. So a lot of the work that I was doing with him also focused on that piece. And then at the same time, I was getting a lot of firefighters, police officers kind of coming in and starting to look at some of the things I was doing because of the networking that I had done. So at that time, I sort of just had this epiphany, why not cater specifically to this audience, hone my message, and when I did that, it was able to really kind of take off from there. And so everything that you're kind of seeing now online is much more professional, I guess, much more on message, on brand than it was, 3 years ago. If I could pull up some of my archived posts from a few years ago, they look completely different. So it's been trial and error, a lot of it, and then just, finding mentors and then developing myself on a personal and professional level.
No, I like that. And Susan, there's a lot of good lessons to kind of be pulled out of there. I love the fact that, you wanted to get into performance nutrition, but you had a young family. So pulling all those hours that would, require to work with a football team at the collegiate level, et cetera, you couldn't do. But rather than to be like, I can't do it, you created this other platform. You use that time to create the other platform in your, quote unquote downtime, which I can imagine with kids is, in the middle of the night, knowing having 2 young kids myself. And then I like about, kind of the process that you went through to find your voice, that it wasn't you just decided, okay, I'm going to be the tactical dietitian and everything's going to be on point and I'm going to be here. There was a process to get there. And I like highlighting that because, to remind folks, your first post or your first whatever, they don't have to be perfect.
Yeah.
You're going to make some mistakes. It's more about just getting out and doing it. I've learned
and
that.
And that was a big hurdle. I really believe that really high performing dietitians, we do tend to be a little bit perfectionists sometimes about things. And getting over that hump of it doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be out there. And then we can tweak it as needed. Kind of getting over that, it needs to look perfect. It needs to be perfect. I need to say the perfect thing.
Oh, yeah.
I had to get over that, and I had to also be able to feel okay interjecting my personality into the material that I put out there. That was a big hump, actually.
No, I appreciate that. I struggle with that for the little that I do, and and then just realizing, most people, the criticism that you're thinking is going to come in your head are from people who probably aren't doing much. So, don't pay them any mind anyway. So that's great. I'm glad we talked about communication, because I've told you before, I think that's really your superpower, in terms of, you're a great dietitian, obviously, but the information I see you putting out is visually appealing, and you're taking these nutrition concepts and you're breaking them down so that, young private, that young specialist, anyone really can see that image and understand it and get that concept. Where does that come from? Is that trial and error, or do you kind of have always had that knack, that artistic eye?
Well, if you ask my husband, he'll tell you that I've always been a talker. Now, from a technical standpoint, I have apps that I use to create the visual graphics. So even the logo that I have, I did create that myself using sort of just this art from some of the technical apps that I use. So that has really upped my visual game quite a bit. So I do recommend, if you're wanting to kind of create those visually appealing posts, to use something that's specific for that. As far as the aesthetic of it goes, if you really look at my posts, they're really all the same logo, same fonts, same colors, and that really helps with sort of that visual piece of it. So I have brand colors that I stick to, so that if somebody is scrolling through their feed, as soon as they see those colors, that logo, that feel of the pictures that I'm posting, they immediately know that they've hit my page. So maybe there's something there that will interest them. Maybe they're more prone to stopping on that page and seeing what else I've posted. Maybe they'll pop into my stories if they see that my Instagram little pink circle is red. So having that style, I think, really makes a big difference. In terms of the information, that again, it's a little bit of trial and error, right? And it's a little bit of being able to translate what you know at a high level into digestible, sometimes simplified pieces of information. Hooking someone in by knowing what your audience's pain points are, right? So if we're talking about soldiers, we know that soldiers love caffeine, nicotine, sarcasm, and a good healthy dose of just unadulterated violence sometimes, right? So knowing your audience is really important. What do they struggle with on a daily basis? They struggle with feeling like they don't have enough time throughout the day. They struggle with sleep, whether that's on their part or because of their schedule. They struggle with finding good things to eat out on the economy, right? Even though many soldiers have the warrior restaurants, the bistros, the dining facilities available to them, they're not always utilizing them the way that they should be. So kind of touching on those pain points and then helping provide solutions for that, right? Using very basic nutrition information, but in language that they use, right? So if you go to my page, you're not going to see a lot of, I don't feel like you're going to see a lot of technical language or a lot of high level things like you would if you were in a college course, right? One of the best things I think that I was taught early on is if you can't explain something down to a 6th grade level, then your audience is probably not going to connect with it, right? So sometimes having to take that high level knowledge and just translate it down into something that's easily digestible, and that touches on the things that they care about, right? So I might think I know what my audience wants to hear, but I really need to hear from my audience what they want me to put out there. And sometimes I'll just put feelers out there. So you go my story sometimes and I'll ask them, hey, what are you experiencing? What are you struggling with right now? What do you need from me to help do things better on your end? So in the virtual space, that's kind of how we discover those pain points. And then of course, just having been a soldier in those situations, junior enlisted and then a baby NCO, I do have some intimate knowledge of kind of what they're experiencing. When we're talking about in person, just being out, in the areas that my soldiers are at is really important. And we can maybe touch on this if you want to, but spending time in the stakeholders' area of operations, right? So if you're fortunate enough as a dietitian to work in a designated space, just make sure you're spending time outside of that space and experiencing things that your soldiers are going through. If you have the opportunity to do a field training exercise, go do the field training exercise. If there's a EIB or ESB happening, you should be out there walking the lanes. Not necessarily to provide a service, but to experience it, to build a rapport. All of those things are really important for understanding how you should be communicating to your audience. You're not going to be able to experience that sitting behind your computer. Although it's very easy to do some days, we get caught up in a lot of the work that needs to be done. But some of the work that should be done needs to really happen out in the field.
No, that's great advice, and I'm a huge fan of it. One, for all the reasons you mentioned. Two, because it's just fun, right? When else as a dietitian are you get to shoot an automatic weapon or do those sort of things? And I always used to joke at regiment, I did more nutrition consults waiting to get on an aircraft, because what else are you going to do? So I appreciate that. Is there any other advice you might give, to these H2F dietitians or any member of the H2F team who are struggling to get their message across?
Yeah, and I know, like even we still struggle with this, right? So even though we feel like we're doing a good job of sort of moving the needle the direction it needs to go, I think it's going to be a struggle. I think kind of like I just mentioned, just knowing what your teams are expecting from you, right? And when I say teams, I mean the soldiers that you're servicing, right? So in any organization, taking time to do some types of needs analysis, I think is really important. And I don't see a lot of organizations doing that, right? Even though we're all working in military units, the culture and the environment in every unit is so very different. The expectations may be different. Even though the core components of H2F are really the same, what is expected and what's needed is always going to be different. So figuring out how to deliver the service that they want, but also the service that they need by doing that analysis. And the way that we did that here was by looking not necessarily at numbers around ABCP, but looking at the new, there was just a recently validated military eating behaviors questionnaire that was released. So we sort of took some components from there. We also added some components of engagement, nutrition knowledge, to just kind of see where our unit was at and what was really needed, and then used that to develop some goals around what kind of programming we want to do. So some interesting data that actually came out of that is, if we're talking about ABCP, we wanted to be able to
identify. And that's the Army Body Composition Program.
The Army Body Composition Program, yep. So we wanted to be able to be really proactive about that, and we wanted to see what we could do to get soldiers into nutrition and H2F services before they potentially were starting to experience issues with their weight, either because of illness or injury. The last couple of years, we've been dealing a lot with COVID shutdowns. So we really wanted to kind of nip that in the bud. So we looked at what risk factors we could identify in our current population that would indicate that they maybe need early intervention before something happens. So one of the things we looked at is whether or not they had been flagged in the past, their history of weight cycling, history of dieting, because even in a non-military population, right, those are all going to be things, weight cycling, yo-yo dieting, those are all going to be things that are going to be indicators of future weight gain. So we were able to work that in there as well, and then made that part of our integration program as well for new soldiers. So again, still working out the kinks, still trying to refine it, right? But that's one of the proactive things that came out of, trying to build the program, trying to get that buy-in was making sure that we knew what the unit, or that we had some idea of what the unit needed from us, right? And then focusing really down the chain and not necessarily up the chain when it comes to the work itself, right? Because doing the work with the soldiers on the ground is the most important thing to make sure that the program is being effective, right? So when we're reporting data up the chain, right, it should be based on the work that we've done down the chain, versus, you know, really just focusing on how can we, what are the words that I want to use?
You know, you don't want to be like the personal trainer for the commander. Yeah, I kind of
Right.
get what you're talking to. Yeah.
Exactly. And that can be okay too, right? Because
Right.
you can get buy-in from your higher command. But really the work you do on the ground, those are the guys who are going to need it, right? Because when you're working with officers, and I do work with some of the different officers and command teams on their personal nutrition, but when you're working with someone who's educated, who is an adult, right? Typically an officer, or maybe even someone who's senior enlisted, they're going to have an easier time integrating changes into their personal life in terms of nutrition sometimes, right? Just access to resources, support, financial, then sometimes a young private will, because that young private also just doesn't know anything. They may not even know how to boil water at this point in their life. So that's kind of what I mean when I say moving your focus down the chain and not necessarily up it.
No, those are great lessons. I love, you know, being proactive and not reactive. We just had Colonel Promotable Tahan on, and you know, she was talking about getting upstream, and so kind of a theme of getting left of the bang. If you can identify those soldiers who might be more at risk before they have those issues, it's always a great thing. And I love the mention of the military eating behavior survey. For those that might not know that it's out there, I can, you know, maybe put a link to that article in the notes, but that was developed by actually my predecessor in this job right now, Colonel Renee Cole, when she was up at USARIUM, developed that. So for any nutrition professionals out there that don't know, there is a military specific eating behavior survey that's out there that you can get access to. So it warms my heart, and I'm sure it'll warm Colonel Cole's heart to know that, you know, folks are out there and utilizing her work. So appreciate that. What about for these military organizations and maybe these H2F teams trying to navigate social media? What accounts do you recommend that they should establish on what platforms? And then, you know, maybe just a very general strategy or things they should do to kind of help get the word out to their soldiers.
Yeah, so I mean, most of the soldiers are going to be on most of your major social media platforms. Instagram seems to be really popular among H2F teams, which I think is great. I also think that Facebook can be a great opportunity because a lot of the, I've seen a lot of the battalions that we work with, the brigade, they do a lot on Facebook as well. So anytime we can expand that reach, I think it's good. There, some I know, I've heard of some doing websites and YouTube channels and whatnot. I think all of that is great, but I think being able to build your audience on one platform is really important before kind of spreading yourself too thin. But utilizing the resources, again, that your soldiers are going to want to see your content on, right? So something else we did with that survey was we asked them where they spend most of their time. And so we stay predominantly on Instagram over here. I think one of the things that's important to understand when you're dealing with social media, though, is that as an administrator of any of those accounts and the content that you put out there, you're competing. You're competing against all of these other influencer accounts, putting out good or bad information. And so really developing your organizational branding and your message, I think, is really important. So just on the tactical dietitian side, there's a method that I kind of use to put out content that really helps to keep me from being too generalized and too all over the place. Because sometimes I feel like if the content doesn't have a specific theme to it, it can be a little bit diluted. And I think sometimes that will lose an audience, just my personal opinion. So I have pillars that I work off of. So if you scroll through my feed, there's always going to be repetitive themes. Meal prepping is a big one. We do talk about supplements a lot just because that is one of the things that my audience is interested in. We also talk about stress and sleep management. We also talk about biofeedback. Even if you go through my feed and you've been following me for some time, you probably know that I'm a fan of tacos, poke bowls, and caffeine in any shape or form. So having a little bit of that personal touch on my page has helped as well. When I post things for the organization, one of the complaints that I kind of hear from service members is that they feel like they don't get information that's specific to them. So what does that mean? So many times when I'm working with a group, I'll kind of ask if they've ever worked with a dietitian or nutritionist before. And usually the answer will be yes. And one of the things that they like to get from us is they like to get I always get asked the question, how many calories should I eat? How much protein, how much carbs should I eat? And it can be very difficult to give that information out specifically to individuals, especially in a setting like social media or even in a group setting. But that's what they want to hear. So how do I deliver that in a way that's going to give them the information that they want, but also be not super prescriptive? So kind of doing that, I feel like is kind of a trial and error and an art that you just kind of learn. So my question, I guess, to go back to your question would be what is the goal with some of these organizations? What is the message that they're trying to put out? Do they have a message? Do they know what their vision is for not only their team, but their social media presence? Because in everything we do nowadays is low touch. So that social media presence is your first impression to the person that you're trying to service. And that's what's going to get them through the door. The H2F program, it should be high touch, right? We should be going out into the community. We should be talking to as many soldiers as possible in group settings, but that social media, that low touch is just how society operates. So figuring out what your audience wants and then delivering it in a way that they feel like they're getting what they need. Because you aren't competing. You're going to be competing against all of these influencers, and you being able to cater to your audience a little bit will help cut through some of that.
I like that in terms of having a mission or vision before you start. I know I've been, even I myself, sometimes guilty of that. You want to put out a message, but take a step back. And then I like the idea of the content themes and establishing pillars that you keep coming back and you're kind of hitting for that organization. So no, that's all great information. And also the reminder of we are competing. I know as a young dietitian, I thought I just gave nutrition information. And then I realized, quickly that no, I'm basically selling myself or selling, what I'm giving to the soldiers. So if I don't sell them on it, no change is going to occur. So no, all great information there. Where can folks find you on, since we're talking about social media?
Yeah, the easiest place to find me would be at tactical.dietitian. Shoot me a message. I usually in my DMs pretty frequently, so if you ask me a question, I'm usually going to answer pretty quickly. That's honestly the easiest way to find me. I actually have my phone number in there as well, so if you click on my links, you can actually send me a text message also if you prefer to use that as well. And
if you're out at what Joint Base Lewis McChord, the soldiers out there, that's where you're H2F.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Any book recommendations?
I do. So when you asked me that question, I made a list because I get asked. I've been asked this question before, and I'm like, as soon as somebody asks me this question, I go completely blank. But one of the books that I read, probably going on almost 20 years now, that really helped to kind of start me on the journey of just being able to communicate and connect well, was a book by John Maxwell called Everyone Communicates, Few Connect. And this is a really great book. He talks about inspiring people, building genuine rapport, authenticity in your messaging. So that's a really great one. Conscious Coaching by Brett Bartholomew, who's actually a strength and conditioning coach. And he's got a lot of great material. That was a fantastic book. And even though it's really geared towards strength and conditioning professionals, I think it's important that dietitians, especially in an H2F role, you have to understand that you're more than a dietitian, you are a coach. So developing that coach mindset, I think is really important. Anything by Simon Sinek, I think, is great. I think he's a phenomenal thought leader. From a nutrition, periodization, nutrition learning perspective, I love Bob Seebahar. I think he's fantastic. So I've read both of his books, Nutrition Periodization and Metabolic Efficiency. And a lot of the coaching I do revolves around nutrition periodization. I do also enjoy a lot of Brad Schoenfeld's work. He wrote a book called The Guide to Hypertrophy. I'm butchering that title. But that's a great book. A lot of the soldiers out here, one of the things that they want to do is get yoked. So understanding what hypertrophy is as a dietitian, energy systems, how to sort of build those programs, I think is important. And then I'm also a big fan of Dr. Layne Norton. So he wrote a book quite a few years ago called Fat Loss Forever. He does a lot of great work in terms of weight loss, I think, not only from an evidence-based perspective, but also just pragmatically, just real-world application. So I'm a big fan of his too.
No, that's great. Quite the list. So I like it. I'll put those down. But yeah, familiar with a lot of those names and have read some of those books. So no, that's great. Well, Susan, thanks so much again for taking your time. I know you're busy and it's a little earlier, out there on the West Coast. So I appreciate you getting up and joining us today. And then, thanks so much for what you're doing in terms of taking care of soldiers and fueling them so they're ready to fight. So thanks again.
No, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Nick.
Awesome. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Join us next week where we'll have another amazing guest. Maybe not as amazing as Susan, but another amazing guest.